Queen is one of those legendary rock outfits that seems impossible to ignore. Their music burst onto the scene in the early 1970s, blending opera and hard rock at a time when most bands stuck to basic riffs and raw vocals. It was as if they arrived with an entire carnival of sound, parading it across every stage they set foot on. The band's iconic frontman, Freddie Mercury, had this uncanny ability to turn a concert into a theatrical spectacle. Yet, for every fan who worshipped their originality, there was someone else, often just as influential in the music world, who absolutely loathed it. How can a band evoke such passionate love on one hand and equally passionate hate on the other? Were they too showy, too pretentious? Did Mercury's flamboyance ruffle the feathers of more traditional rockers? Or was it simply the fact that Queen refused to color inside the lines, straddling the boundary between rock, opera, pop, and everything in between? By the time they skyrocketed to international fame, Queen had not only racked up adoring fans, but also a list of notable enemies. Fellow musicians whose public remarks ranged from mild disdain to outright vitriol. Today we're digging into the stories behind those harsh critiques. You'll hear about the Kansas frontman who took pointed jabs at Mercury's private life, the gothic alternative rocker who found Queen's lavishness unbearable, the punk icon who tried to taunt Freddie in a recording studio, and the no-filter Britpop star who decided to insult Brian May's guitar tone. As you'll soon discover, each critic had unique reasons for their barbs, some personal, some professional, and some that remain baffling even now. Yet, there's a twist. The very qualities that drew such ire also fueled Queen's meteoric success and enduring legacy. Their audacity became their superpower. By the end of this story, you might just see how those hostile words unintentionally helped shape Queen into the unstoppable force we recognize today. So, let's begin with a bold question. What is it about Queen that managed to spark such intense devotion and fierce resentment all at once? In the 1970s, rock music was a thrilling playground populated by legends. You had hard rock heavyweights, soulful singer-songwriters, and experimental acts testing the outer limits of what rock could mean. Yet, even in such a diverse musical landscape, Queen stood out like a flamboyant ringmaster in a monochromatic circus. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1973, gave a taste of their willingness to fuse classic rock with elaborate orchestrations. Then came tracks like Bohemian Rhapsody, which blended opera, progressive rock, and raw emotion into a swirling, multi-part epic. The band's stage shows became equally mesmerizing. Spotlights glared, smoke machines hissed, and Mercury strutted across the stage in sparkling attire, commanding attention with every last ounce of energy in his body. It wasn't just a concert, it was performance art designed to leave audiences breathless. Still, not everyone was on board. In an era when serious rock fans expected gritty guitar solos and unpolished authenticity, Queen's devotion to theatrical flair rubbed some people the wrong way. Traditionalists saw it as pompous, as though the band were mocking the established norms of rock. Critics in the music press often labeled them too gimmicky or unnecessarily showy. There were also whispers that Mercury's costumes and over-the-top persona overshadowed the music itself, a charge that would follow Queen throughout their career. Yet, it's precisely that blend of theatricality and classic rock crunch that secured Queen's place in music history. People flocked to their concerts to feel something beyond the usual. Where other bands might have played it safe, Queen consistently took risks, whether it was layering dozens of vocal tracks for a single part or wearing outrageous costumes that dared audiences not to stare. While critics sniffed at the spectacle, fans showed up in droves, electrified by the band's originality. As we'll see, however, not everyone in the music scene shared this admiration. A wave of high-profile detractors emerged, some from completely different musical backgrounds, others from similar rock territories, each with their own complaint. Some found Mercury's persona off-putting, while others bristled at the concept of grand rock opera. Their jabs, however, would only spur Queen to push the boundaries even further. One early and rather surprising critic was Steve Walsh, the enigmatic frontman and keyboardist for Kansas. While Kansas was known for a progressive rock style that featured violin sections and philosophical lyrics, they generally kept a relatively straightforward image. Steve Walsh himself was recognized for his remarkable vocal range, not dissimilar in versatility to Mercury's. At first glance, you might expect the frontman of Kansas to appreciate the theatrical, musically complex approach that Queen embodied. And indeed, in some interviews, Walsh expressed respect for the intricate musicianship and production values Queen brought to their records. He had admitted to finding their layered vocal harmonies and rich instrumentation to be spectacular feats of studio creativity. However, his tune changed drastically when the subject turned to Freddie Mercury. In an offhanded but pointed remark, Walsh once described Mercury with a derogatory term, implying that Freddie was all flash and no substance. There was even a hint of mocking Mercury's sexuality, a quick jab that felt mean-spirited rather than purely musical in nature. Many fans and observers speculated that Walsh's disdain could stem from jealousy. After all, Mercury's command of the stage often eclipsed everyone else, and Queen had a habit of hogging the spotlight whenever they appeared on shared bills or festivals. Yet, it might also be true that Walsh, like many rock purists of the time, simply couldn't reconcile Mercury's flamboyance with what he felt authentic rock should be. It's also possible he was uncomfortable with how openly Mercury broke from traditional notions of masculinity. Kansas continued on its own trajectory, scoring hits like Carry On Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind. But Steve Walsh's remarks remained a curious footnote. Why take such a personal dig at someone who, at least musically, might have been considered a kindred spirit in pushing progressive boundaries? Could it be that Mercury, who was never subtle about his style or persona, pushed Walsh's buttons in ways that had little to do with the music and more to do with personal insecurities? Whatever the case, that tension served as one of the earliest signs that Queen's flamboyance and Mercury's forthrightness would be a polarizing force. For many of their contemporaries, it was a breath of fresh air. For others, it was simply too much. For Walsh in particular, it might have been a reminder that the world of progressive rock was changing, and that Queen's brand of boundary-pushing showmanship could overshadow those who didn't match its sheer audacity. But Steve Walsh was only the beginning. As the years passed, more high-profile musicians would step forward with even harsher criticisms, some of which cut deeper than a passing insult about personal style. Robert Smith of The Cure represents a very different corner of music, brooding post-punk and gothic rock that seemed a world apart from Queen's arena anthems. A man of moody lyricism, smudged eyeliner, and a penchant for wearing black on black, Smith cultivated an image rooted in introspection and emotional rawness. So when he spoke about Queen, he didn't mince words. I never liked Queen. I hated Queen and everything they did. To understand the starkness of this statement, you have to consider the cultural context. In the late 1970s, punk and post-punk emerged as a rebellious response to what some saw as the bloated extravagance of progressive and arena rock. The Cure, although more melodic and introspective than raw punk, still came from a scene that valued stripped-down authenticity over grand, polished productions. Queen, with its orchestral layers and Mercury's showy persona, represented everything that movement wanted to tear down. Yet, there's an intriguing paradox here. Both Robert Smith and Freddie Mercury operated outside the mainstream norms of their time, each carving out a distinctive space in rock. Mercury embraced flamboyance and musical theater influences. Smith embraced dark introspection and minimalistic production. In a different world, you could imagine them finding common ground as pioneers who refused to conform to a single genre. Instead, Smith's dismissive statements highlight that sometimes artists who are themselves rebels can't always appreciate the radical spirit in others, especially if it's expressed through a style they find grating. Smith once described his early musical heroes as those who tore down barriers, punk icons who stood against the pomp and puffery of mainstream rock. From his point of view, Queen was the epitome of bloated grandeur, the exact opposite of the do-it-yourself ethos that shaped The Cure's initial rise. As far as Smith was concerned, it wasn't just about Mercury's personality. It was about the entire package: the overproduced albums, the meticulously choreographed shows, and the aura of theatrical excess. Even so, it's notable that while Smith hurled sweeping criticisms at Queen's body of work, he rarely targeted Mercury's personal life or identity in the same pointed way Steve Walsh did. Smith's dislike sounded purely aesthetic and philosophical, rooted in a belief that rock had grown too pompous. For him, Queen was the ultimate symbol of that pomp, Ironically, Smith himself would become a legend for forging a style that many found impenetrable or overly self-indulgent, especially as The Cure moved deeper into dark, atmospheric records. So it's possible that he too engaged in a bit of hypocrisy. Maybe a rebellious band in heavy makeup can't entirely escape accusations of overdoing it. Regardless, Robert Smith's open hostility toward Queen underscores how Mercury and his bandmates polarized not just mainstream rockers, but also artists who considered themselves outside the mainstream. And it didn't stop there. If Robert Smith's critique rested on a clash of aesthetics, the next wave of disdain came from someone who refused to see any value in Queen at all, an artist who found Mercury's highbrow aspirations downright offensive. Paul Weller's name has been tied to multiple influential bands, The Jam, The Style Council, and later his own solo ventures. He's often described as the quintessential British songwriter who values gritty realism, social commentary, and a working-class ethos. Given that background, his reaction to Freddie Mercury's famous statement about bringing ballet to the working classes was swift and scathing. If Mercury saw it as a cheeky line that encapsulated his desire to break boundaries and fuse high art with rock, Weller saw it as the height of pretentiousness. At the time, the Jam stood out for its blend of punk energy and mod revival influences. They wore sharp suits, sang about everyday struggles, and presented themselves in a grounded, no-nonsense fashion. Weller was no fan of glitter cannons or elaborate theatrical costumes. In his eyes, Mercury's flamboyance and Queen's arena spectacles seemed more like shallow showboating than genuine musical exploration. He also disliked what he perceived as Mercury's elitist tone, though many Queen fans would argue that Mercury was trying to do the opposite of elitism by bringing high art forms like ballet or operatic vocals into rock, effectively sharing them with mass audiences who might otherwise never experience them. For Weller, it felt more like an attention-grabbing gimmick, disconnected from the harsh realities that most working-class folks endured. This critique mirrors a broader sentiment that came from certain corners of the punk and post-punk scenes. There was a belief that rock had become bloated and overly concerned with spectacle, drifting away from the raw energy and immediacy that originally defined the genre. Weller, who built his reputation on crisp, punchy songs that tackled real issues, likely found Mercury's grand statements about ballet both puzzling and infuriating. Mercury, for his part, rarely responded to these sorts of barbs in detail. He was known to shrug off or laugh at insults, preferring to channel his energy into the next album or performance. Where Weller saw gimmicks, Mercury saw artistic freedom. Where Weller saw pomposity, Mercury saw an invitation for everyone to experience a side of music they'd never felt before. The clash between Weller and Mercury speaks to a deeper cultural divide. Some musicians believed rock should always remain close to its rough, street-level roots, while others believed that rock could and should encompass anything under the sun, from classical violins to tap-dancing routines. Queen clearly fell in the latter camp, forging ahead despite protests from purists. Yet this was hardly the most sensational of Queen's confrontations. Next, we turn to one of the most infamous and heated run-ins, one that involved a punk legend notorious for stirring up trouble wherever he went. If Freddie Mercury was the flamboyant ringmaster of 1970s rock, Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols was the snarling, spit-in-your-eye anarchist of the emerging punk scene. The Sex Pistols aimed to torch the establishment, from the monarchy to mainstream rock acts they deemed self-indulgent. Queen, with its meticulous studio productions and elaborate live shows, stood out as a perfect target. The tension boiled over during a famous encounter at a recording studio in London. As the story goes, both Queen and the Sex Pistols were laying down tracks in adjacent studios. At some point, Vicious, never one to shy away from provocation, burst in on Mercury and taunted him with a sneer. "Have you succeeded in bringing ballet to the masses yet?" This jab referenced Mercury's earlier statements about blending rock and high art. It was a direct hit aimed at the very core of what made Queen different. Mercury, never one to be intimidated, retorted with a witty put-down of his own, reportedly calling Sid Simon Ferocious or some other offbeat twist on his name. Legend has it that Mercury didn't just verbally brush off Vicious, but physically escorted him out of the studio after finding his rude invasion unacceptable. It was a definitive clash between two musical movements, the raw, chaotic energy of punk and the grand, polished theatricality of glam-infused rock. For many onlookers, this skirmish crystallized how starkly different these worlds were. The Sex Pistols wanted to tear down the very concepts that Queen embodied: virtuosity, polished production, complex arrangements, and star-level glamour. Meanwhile, Queen saw no reason to apologize for integrating opera or ballet into their shows. To them, it was all part of the creative playground that rock could be. Despite, or perhaps because of, these explosive differences, both the Sex Pistols and Queen left permanent marks on music history. One introduced a sneering brand of punk that spat on tradition, while the other orchestrated a panoramic, genre-blending style that soared across stadiums. In a sense, each made the other look more extreme by contrast, an ironic dynamic that helped fuel both movements in the public imagination. Sid Vicious, of course, remained a poster child for punk's destructive tendencies. Freddie Mercury, meanwhile, continued to belt out anthems in ways that seemed to defy the limits of vocal expression. Their confrontation symbolizes an era when clashing ideologies in music were at their peak. When Mercury escorted Sid out the door, it wasn't just about one musician telling another off. It was a microcosm of glam versus punk, old guard versus new wave, decadence versus nihilism. And yet, the list of Queen's detractors did not stop with the punks. As the band sailed into the 1980s and beyond, new critics emerged from across the musical spectrum. One of the most vocal was a Britpop icon known for his brash opinions and quick temper. Liam Gallagher, the outspoken former frontman of Oasis, is infamous for his unfiltered commentary. From feuding with his brother Noel to mouthing off about anyone in the industry he perceives as pompous, Gallagher has never been one to restrain his remarks. True to form, he's had more than a few choice words about Queen. In interviews, Gallagher has dismissed Queen with a bluntness that would make many of his peers blush. While he begrudgingly acknowledged Mercury's vocal prowess, I get Freddie Mercury had a great voice and all that. He followed it up by labeling the band as a bit Queeny, implying they were too theatrical for his taste. He also took a direct shot at Brian May, describing May's signature guitar tone as though it was clogged in his ass. For a guitarist as widely respected as May, it was a particularly cutting remark, less about genuine critique and more about Liam's flair for tasteless soundbites. The fact that Oasis, at its peak, boasted a similarly massive stadium audience makes Gallagher's stance all the more intriguing. Like Queen, Oasis played to enormous crowds who sang along to anthemic tracks. But where Queen was polished and diverse in its influences, Oasis presented themselves as working-class lads with guitars, couched in an unvarnished Britpop swagger. Gallagher's entire persona revolved around the idea that raw attitude trumped elaborate showmanship. One could argue that Liam's swaggering approach to fronting a band owed something to Mercury's own unbreakable confidence, though the two men expressed that confidence in drastically different ways. While Mercury wore tights and strutted like a peacock on stage, Gallagher wore parka jackets and sneered at the microphone stand as if daring it to challenge him. Each had a signature style that demanded attention. Yet, Gallagher clearly wanted nothing to do with any suggestion that he might share a theatrical lineage with Mercury. To this day, Gallagher occasionally references Queen in less than flattering terms when asked, although he often shrugs it off as just him telling it like it is. Whether driven by a genuine dislike for bombastic rock or a calculated move to stir controversy, something Gallagher has admitted to doing, a part of his brand is to take shots at sacred cows. And in the pantheon of rock, Queen is about as sacred as they come. From Steve Walsh's veiled jabs to Robert Smith's sweeping condemnation, from Paul Weller's indignation over ballet to Sid Vicious' direct confrontation, and finally Liam Gallagher's crude insults, Queen attracted an array of passionate critics. But here's the twist. Each of those criticisms, whether personal or ideological, helped solidify Queen's place in the rock pantheon. Why? Because controversy can be a powerful catalyst for fame. When a band garners both adoration and hatred, the conversation surrounding them intensifies. People want to know, why do some musicians loathe them so much? What is it about their sound and style that provokes such strong feelings? The intrigue alone draws more listeners, fans, and media attention. Love them or hate them, you end up talking about them. Moreover, the same elements that outrage their peers, over-the-top shows, genre-blending anthems, and Mercury's unapologetically flamboyant presence, are precisely what made Queen unforgettable. They took the framework of rock and rolled it into uncharted territory, layering operatic vocals and elaborate narratives that set them apart. It's this willingness to experiment and break free from traditional expectations that turned them into legends. Queen also benefited from Mercury's ability to shrug off criticism with a grin and a well-timed one-liner. Rather than bowing to external pressure to tone down their act, the band doubled down, creating performances that were bigger, bolder, and more spectacular. It might have offended the purists, but it thrilled the crowds who packed stadiums to sing along to "We Will Rock You" and "We Are the Champions." In the end, each detractor served as a small but meaningful counterpoint in the grand story of Queen. Their harsh words underscored just how distinct Queen was from the rest of the rock universe. If nobody hated them, they probably wouldn't have been pushing boundaries hard enough. Legends are rarely mild or universally adored. They stir strong reactions. Queen certainly did that. Queen's story is one of both inspiration and provocation. They refused to be ordinary, blending rock with opera and embracing a theatrical style that demanded attention. Whether you consider them pioneers or pretentious posers is ultimately subjective. Yet the fact remains that Queen achieved an iconic status that has stood the test of time. Their performances continue to captivate new generations, their songs remain anthems, and Freddie Mercury's persona still looms larger than life. The criticisms of contemporaries like Steve Walsh, Robert Smith, Paul Weller, Sid Vicious, and Liam Gallagher highlight a fundamental truth about creative expression. Breaking rules almost always sets you apart, and that can make people uneasy. By daring to be different, Queen ensured they'd never be lost in the shuffle of ordinary rock bands. And perhaps that's the ultimate compliment, to evoke not just love, but also hate, because indifference means you haven't made an impact at all. So the next time you find yourself belting out Bohemian Rhapsody, or stomping along to "We Will Rock You," remember that behind these legendary tracks lies a turbulent history of scornful peers and defiant ambition. Queen's legacy is built on audacity as much as talent. In the face of all the sneers, the insults, and the outright hostility, they never toned themselves down. Instead, they gave the world an unforgettable spectacle, one that still resonates decades later.